Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to History Class, live from the other side of my yard. I figured I'd change it up on you a little bit. Yesterday, we looked at kind of the history of the Middle East in recent times, starting with Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today, we're going to move just a little bit east and look at events in Iran and Iraq. So Iran was the land that was the land of like ancient Persia back in the day. If you remember us talking about the Persian Empire all that time back with Darius and Xerxes and so on, that's the same land. And then Iraq was the land known as Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent, and the Sumerians and all that stuff that we talked about way back at the beginning. So after World War I, you see, the Arab world is kind of divided up against in these different mandates and so forth, and you have a whole bunch of new Arab nations, Saudi Arabia, all that stuff. But we said that Iran though they were independent before World War I, and they continue the dynasty of the Pahlavi dynasty that we mentioned in an earlier video, maybe 3 weeks ago now, maybe a month. Time is starting to blend together. It feels like it's been 18 years since I've been able to eat in a restaurant, or really had any social interaction. So, other than my talking volleyball friend Wilson, just kidding. Okay, anyway, so the Pahlavi dynasty with the title of Shah continues, and the second leader of Iran in the post-war era is yet another Pahlavi, Reza Shah Pahlavi. And one thing that's interesting to note about Iranian history is we alluded to this, I think, in one of the Cold War lessons. There was this moment where Iran had switched to having they had started to add a parliamentary system, and the people they voted for was a guy by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a hard socialist, communist sympathizing, and looked like he was going to kind of position Iran as potentially an ally of the Soviet Union, and we really didn't want that because Iranian oil was valuable. So we actually sent like CIA people, did some like undercover stuff to help ensure the overthrow of the Mossadegh regime, and so the Iran continued to be essentially a monarchy. Now, so they continued to be a monarchy, but they were generally pro-Western, and they favored the interest of the West over against those of the Soviet Union. And so he's one of the guys, I can't remember if it was this class or the American class, where I talked about, the foreign policy dilemma that Americans dealt with of, on one hand, we're trying to win this moral victory over the moral evil of communism, but sometimes that is going to require allying with people that we don't consider paragons of morality. And so I think it was President Truman famously had the saying that he's a son of a gun, shall we say, but he's our son of a gun, shall we say. And so this is an example of that. So we supported Pahlavi even though we knew that he was kind of a bad guy. So and Iran, though, despite the fact that he did have like a secret police type apparatus, and they didn't really have like full freedom of speech and stuff like that, but they did have something of a market economy, and they actually were pretty modern. We think of Iran as kind of a backward nation now because of the way things went with the 79 revolution, which we're about to get to. But in 1975, you would turn on, I've seen clips of the Iranian nightly news, and it's, women with no veil and makeup dressed up in the latest fashions. It looked like it might as well have been, the local news in Los Angeles or San Francisco or something like that. Well, Iran takes a turn in a drastically different direction. So the Shah is starting to get more and more unpopular, and you've got a whole bunch of groups that oppose him that don't really have anything in common with each other except that they don't like the guy in charge. So you've got some people in Iran that are communist. You've got some people in Iran that want democracy, and then you've got some people in Iran that are radical Islamists. That is, they want what they call Sharia law, they want the caliphate to be restored, and they wanted theocratic rule by the Islamic priesthood. in Iran, we should note, is one of the world's only majority Shiite Muslim countries. So they're not Sunni. They're a little bit different type of Muslim than some of the other countries. So they wanted the Shiite leaders, who were known as the Ayatollahs, this third faction, to rule the country. Of these Islamists, one of the most radical figures is an Ayatollah by the name of Ruhollah Khomeini, and that's spelled Khoemeni. I think. don't quote me on it. So anyway, Ayatollah Khomeini is actually exiled to France. He's kicked out of Iran because the Shah considers him a threat, and rightfully so, as we'll see. Somewhere in the process of the protest, the Shah gets mad. This is in the middle of the mid to late 1970s, like right before 79, 78 or so, I think is when the process really gets rolling. 79 is when the revolution officially happens. So 78, the Shah, basically orders some soldiers to open fire on some protesters and kills a few protesters. After that happens, they're a Shiite Muslim country. There's a Shiite ritual where typically in Shiite lands, they do a second funeral 40 days after someone dies. So someone dies, they do like a funeral a few days later, and then they do another one 40 days later. It's just a part of their religious culture. So what happens is he kills these protesters, and then 40 days later, when they do the memorial, it kind of stirs everyone up, and it leads to another protest, and then he gets mad at them, and some more of them get shot, and it turns into this cycle where we're having violence break out in the streets every 40 days when they do these memorials. Like every time everyone goes to the funeral, gets ticked at the Shah for killing the guys, and then starts another one. So it's getting worse and worse, and by now the American president was a guy by the name of Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter was a very nice man, a very good man, and not the strongest president we've ever had by any means. He's actually towards the bottom in terms of the modern presidents. I hate to say that about the guy because he seems like a decent gentleman from everything everyone says, but nonetheless not the best leader we've ever had, to be honest. So Carter was one thing that he wanted to do was he wanted to kind of ease America out of some of these uneasy alliances with these guys that we had been friends with just because they didn't like the Russians that we otherwise would have disapproved of. And Shah Pahlavi is one of the premier examples of this. So Carter basically says, we're not supporting your regime anymore. We're not going to give you any guns or anything that you might use against protests and stuff like that. These different factions, the communists, the Muslim, the Islamists, and the pro-democracy forces kind of all agree to kind of join forces and work toward the overthrow of Iran and then try to figure it out amongst each other later. By the time the revolution is finished, though, the revolution is commandeered completely by the Islamist faction. And the leader of the Islamists ultimately becomes this man Khomeini, who had been sent out to France, but he was recording sermons on audio cassette from Paris and having them smuggled back into Iran that were calling for overthrowing the Shah, for pushing Islamic theocratic government. And ultimately, Khomeini was a very charismatic figure. Honestly, of all the people in history, I think more than anyone else, with the possible exception of Hitler, looking at him, well, and Charles Manson, the serial killer. But other than those two guys, looking at Khomeini gives me the creeps worse than anyone. If there's I think there's a picture of him in your textbook. If you want to look in the index, it's under KH something, and look up a picture of Khomeini. His eyes are stone cold killer, like Khomeini scares me to death to look at. He just gives me the creeps. And so Khomeini, though, for whatever reason, somehow or another, I'd have figured people would have been scared of him, but for whatever reason, he's able to really rally people to his side. And Khomeini emerges as the leader of the Iranian Revolution. And so the 1979 Iranian Revolution turns into a full-scale Islamic coup. and it completely changes the Middle East, because for most of the period from 48 to 70 something, the Middle East was dominated by leaders that were pursuing a vision similar to that of Nasser of Egypt, who we talked about the other day. So Jamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president, kind of led this whole kind of pan-Arab socialist movement or whatever. That's kind of what the majority of the Middle Eastern leadership structure had looked like outside of the traditional monarchies like Saudi Arabia. So Iran is the first real country since the ancient caliphate, not ancient, but the medieval caliphate, since the days of the caliphs of the Middle Ages. He's the first one. It's the first government that's actually ruled by the Islamic priesthood since Muhammad's initial successors. And they completely change the rules of everything. They end a lot of the westernization. They make it against the law for women to walk out in public without veils over their faces. Who knew that was going to be coming to America towards you? Only it's going to be for both sexes, but who knew? But anyway, so they made everyone wear a veil, or not everyone, but they made all the women wear a veil. In fact, and actually, I should say that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has a lot of rules like this as well. Some of the other Islamic countries, but more so after '79, the Iranian Revolution causes a lot of this stuff. Actually, if you were a woman, I think it was in Iran, I think you couldn't leave the house without a male relative as a chaperone. You were not allowed to listen to any like Western music, any of the rock and roll music or anything like that. That could get you thrown in jail or something. Weren't allowed to, women weren't allowed to wear makeup to the extent that you could see their face in the first place. All the typical Islamic rules, no alcohol, tobacco, just basically they just complete everything according to the Islamic rule. And on top of that, not only was that the law, but they also like deputized these like bands of vigilantes to kind of wander the streets with baseball bats and stuff and beat the tar out of anybody who wasn't following. So if you if you were some other religion than Muslim, or if you were a Muslim but you were found going to a disco or something, because this was that time period, or anything like that, anything that violated, their Islamic code, like those people had the right to just work you over with a baseball bat any time now. And of course, I mean, that goes if they found women in the street without the veil on, or without a chaperone or whatever, they could just be beaten up. So this very, very repressive regime, it would have been no fun to live under, to say the least. So Iran becomes like this like deeply Islamic society. Well, this actually starts a trend of Khomeini inspires a lot of other Muslim groups to want to do the same thing. So Khomeini helps to radicalize even further some of the stuff going on in Palestine. It pushes Islamic groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt further to the extremist side. It inspires the foundation of groups like Al-Qaeda and Hamas. We should say that Khomeini starts his own terrorist group called Hezbollah that gets itself involved in Israeli affairs and all sorts of things. Iran, and some of those people looked at Khomeini as a heretic because he was a Shiite, but it still kind of inspired the idea of why can't we go do a Sunni version of this. And the thing about the way Iran is set up now, their real ruler is an actual Islamic priest by the name of the Supreme Leader. And the Supreme Leader at any given time is going to take the title of Ayatollah. There's many Ayatollahs, not just the main one, but that's going to be his title. And there's going to be a council of Ayatollahs, that's similar to like the College of Cardinals in the Catholic Church or something like that help kind of rule the country. And then they do vote for an Iranian president and they do have an Iranian parliament, but to be a candidate for one of those offices, you have to be approved by the supreme leader and the guardian council. And so what happens is you don't get like much of a choice. It's essentially like a one-party state type thing. And so anything that happens has to be within the range of approved opinions of the priest, and the priesthood really run the country. Iran becomes America's public enemy number one or number two behind the Soviet Union really fast, because in 1979, radicals lay siege to the American embassy. Iran officially claims that this was just a student protest movement. Almost everyone believes that the Iranian government was behind it. Either way, they took everyone in the American embassy hostage and held them hostage for over a year. And it was a very destructive thing for Carter's presidency. He worked very hard to try to get it fixed, but he wasn't able to get it done. Ultimately, when Ronald Reagan gets elected, Reagan had openly said on the campaign trail, when he's elected president in 1980, Reagan had said on the campaign trail, day one, the first act in office is, if those hostages aren't free, I'm sending bombs to Iran. Day one. And day one, when Reagan is inaugurated, that same day, the hostages go free. And there's kind of a difference of opinion whether, because Carter had worked very hard to the last end trying to negotiate this stuff, but it's also a school of thought that this is largely in response to knowing that Reagan kind of meant business about going to war over it, that led to the change. So that's something that people kind of debate a little bit, who should get credit for that rescue. It doesn't matter either way, they finally got home, but not after a long time that really kind of humiliated the United States. In the midst of a 1970s, it was kind of a decade where we suffered lots of humiliations with the Watergate scandal and losing the Vietnam War and all that kind of stuff. Actually, there's a handful. This is interesting. There's a movie about this called Argo. They kind of fictionalized the ending of it to make it more dramatic, but the main point of the story is true, that there's a handful of these guys who'd actually escaped the American embassy and got to the Canadian one, which, the Canadian one is a little bit less obvious of a political target, and if you're asking, well, I'll get to that in a second. So anyway, the CIA came up with a plot to break the people out of the Canadian embassy by sending a film crew, pretending to be a Canadian film crew, and filming a fake sci-fi movie called Argo in Iran, and all the actors, quote unquote, were really CIA agents and smuggled the guys out of there. It's a really cool story. You should look into it sometime if you get the chance, or watch that movie Argo. But and Ayatollah Khomeini hated the United States of America. If you ever heard people in the Muslim world call America the Great Satan, that was a phrase that first came into the lexicon through Khomeini. And so why did the Islamic radicals hate America so much? There's a couple of things. One is the sense that we were morally wrong. So American culture is a lot looser about a lot of things that Islamic culture is very tight about. So that's part of it. They would look at, an American city as a den of sin and so on. Some of it is resentment of democracy. So, they kind of think that democracy, to an extent, is they look at it as being antithetical to the way that they believe Allah wants the world to be governed, which is through Sharia law. So they want a worldwide caliphate, and America is standing in the way. And not only are they standing in the way, but they're standing in the way with this very powerful idea of democracy that had moved parts of the Arab world away from Islamism. And then the third thing was, and this might have been the most important, was they resented American support for the nation of Israel. So America has been a major ally of Israel since day one, with the exception, Obama kind of wobbled on that a little bit. I would not have liked him very much if I was Israeli. I didn't like him that much as an American, to be honest, but I certainly would not have liked him if I was Israeli. And by I didn't like him that much, I mean I really didn't like him. But anyway, with very few exceptions, we've been very pro-Israel in our history, and the Arab world really disdained that because of the Israeli-Palestinian rivalry that we talked about yesterday. So those combinations of things really kind of turns the Iranian and also the Arabic public opinion largely against the United States. Meanwhile, and of course, the U.S. does have some allies in the region, though, that are of the Islamic world. That we're supposedly close with the Saudis. That's a very disconcerting relationship because the Saudi royal family really is bad people. But we have some common enemies in the radical Islamic faction. Because one thing you have to understand if you want to understand the Islamic world is that the governments of countries like Saudi Arabia, the secular monarchies and stuff, are as much the target of Islamic radicalism and violence as the Western democracies are. They look at the government of Saudi Arabia, which is a, secular. They do have very restrictive rules. I think women just gained the right to drive like 3 years ago. So they do have, pretty restrictive rules in Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, they're not governed on Sharia law per se. They've thrown the Islamists some bones to try to keep them from causing too much trouble. And Saudi Arabia has funded some of the terrorists as a way to kind of buy them off, almost like paying bribes to we'll go give you some money to go shoot some Americans with if you'll leave us alone and not overthrow our monarchy that we know you also don't like. So, and the Saudi monarchy and some of these other ones really became wealthy off of the presence of oil because a significant number of the world's oil reserves are in the Middle East. In fact, as the storm tries to knock over my recording studio here, in 1973, in response to American support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the Arab world embargoed oil sales to the United States and caused oil shortages that lasted several years and helped cripple the American economy for much of the 1970s. You can ask your parents probably if they were alive in the 70s. If not, your grandparents probably could tell you this. There was a period of time, a couple years in the 70s, where you actually had to line up for gas on certain days because there wasn't enough oil to go around. So depending on what the first letter of your license plate was you could get gas on Monday versus Tuesday or whatever. So meanwhile, another important development in the Middle East, neighboring Iran, there on the Arabic Peninsula in the old land of Mesopotamia, is the developments in the land of Iraq. And so Iraq, as of the immediate post-war period, was a kingdom with a old-school monarchy. I want to say the guy's name was Faisal or something. I'm trying to recall that from college. I don't remember. But anyway, they had a king, though. But he was overthrown by a military dictatorship that was more or less the same ideology as Nasser. The party that overthrew them was known as the Ba'ath Party. And the Ba'ath Party was a group that functioned in both Iraq and Syria and produced two of the worst tyrants of the 20th century, which is, that's a long list because you got Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot and Lenin. And, there's a lot of bad guys during that particular 100 years. But the Ba'ath Party came to power in Syria and installed the family regime known as the Assads. And then in Iraq, I can't remember if this was the first or second Ba'ath ruler, but either the first or second Ba'ath ruler was a man by the name of Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein is a lunatic. The man is crazy. And we wind up having to go to war with him twice. And we'll get to the first one today, and we'll talk about the second one next week as we get closer to our grand finale here. But so Saddam Hussein, let me tell you just a story or two about Saddam, just kind of set up how crazy this guy is. I read a book about him one time. In it, he said that there was his Iraq was such a brutal regime. At one time, a child in a first grade class wrote on the chalkboard, "Saddam is a donkey." And the kid was sentenced to going into a prison and hanging. They hung the kid up in stocks, with chains on his wrist until he lost the feeling in his hands and couldn't use them anymore. There's another time they said he was famous for going on these long tirades in his cabinet meetings where he would just talk and talk and talk. And this one guy was a high-ranking military official, one of his top guys, and he had a wife who was going into delivery. He was pregnant, he was about to deliver a baby. And he asked to be excused from this long, rambling cabinet meeting to go be with his wife in the hospital. Saddam was so offended he asked to leave the meeting that he pulled a handgun out of his holster and shot him in front of everyone and then kept on talking. Like, so this dude's psycho. And he becomes the leader of Iraq. And the thing is, Saddam, although he does have some ties to some Islamic terror organizations and does fuel some terrorism towards Israel and so on, he basically is more of the Nasserite model that, of relatively secular socialist, that kind of thing. Whereas Khomeini was this kind of diehard Islamist. Saddam was probably a Muslim, but he was not very devout. One thing to understand about Saddam, too, one thing you got to understand about Iraq, because we'll talk a little bit about the U.S.-Iraq war next week. The thing you got to get about Iraq is that Iraq, which is right next to Iran is the only, that I'm aware of, predominantly Shiite country in the Middle East. In Syria. Syria, I think, it might be majority Shiite, too. In Iraq, 2/3 of the people are Shiite, but the 1/3 that are Sunni, Saddam Hussein was Sunni. So you've got the 1/3 minority kind of ruling over a 2/3 Shiite majority, and when the Iraq war kind of takes Saddam's strong hand out of the situation, we're going to have a civil war, and that's going to be what America really gets sunk into. So anyway, so Saddam, he comes into power, and Khomeini and Hussein wind up kind of butting heads pretty quick. And from 1980 until 1988, they fight the Iran-Iraq War, which is one of the nastiest wars of recent times. And Saddam openly uses chemical weapons. Now, somewhere, between World War I and II, almost all the nations of the world agreed to something called the Geneva Protocols that agreed to certain rules of war, that if you broke them, you would be considered a war criminal and liable to be charged after the war. And some of those things were things like not pretending to surrender and then killing people, a handful of things like that. But one of the most important ones was no use of chemical weapons. Everyone agreed that the use of poisonous gas in World War I had been such a humanitarian tragedy, we'd never do it again. And, for the most part, it was rare even in World War II, even with psychopaths in charge in Germany. Obviously, they used them on POWs, but not as much on people on the battlefield. Saddam actually uses chemical weapons in the Iranian war, which really marks him as a bad guy. But the thing is, we had so much trouble with Iran that we actually semi-supported Saddam. We really kind of encouraged the Iran-Iraq war because we thought it would be kind of good for both sides to bleed each other out a little bit. And so we actually sent some guns and stuff to Iraq. And then what's funny, that happens in the 1980s, and then 1991 we're going to be at war with Saddam Hussein. So we have this pattern of interaction in the Middle East where multiple times we've fueled one side against a opponent that we have, and then have to turn around and fight them later. That's the same thing happens with Osama bin Laden, who got his start fighting the Soviets with the group, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which we alluded to earlier. And then, he used a lot of the infrastructure that we helped create to turn against us at the end of the Soviet war. Turned his little band of fighters into the terror group Al-Qaeda that carried out 9/11 and several other terrorist attacks, including the sinking of the USS Cole and embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania of American embassies. So the Iran-Iraq War is a humanitarian crisis. When Reagan was president, we actually fight an undeclared naval war against Iran, known as the Tanker War. It never turned into a full-scale war. Your parents might not even remember it because it wasn't deeply publicized, but there were shootings that took place between American and Iranian battleships and submarines in the Persian Gulf, where Iran was trying to harass ships taking oil to America, and we weren't going to put up with it. So there were some shots fired. It never turned into like a full-scale true war, but some stuff did go down there. We mentioned in the video the other day that Lebanon got caught in a very complicated civil war. I won't even try to dip my toes into it because there's so much going on there. But all these different factions, the Shiites, the Sunnis, the Israelis had interest in the region. They wound up with like 4 or 5 governments kind of fighting. at the same time. The Lebanese Civil War, I will say, though, has a difficult effect on the remaining Middle Eastern. Lebanon was the most Christian nation remaining in the Middle East. They still had about a 15 to 20% Christian population. They suffered pretty heavily during the war, and in recent years, some of the some countries like Iraq have gone from 5-7% Christian to down to like 1-2 because of how bad the persecution has gotten since the government that came in after the war, which is really a shame and probably something we should have done more to prevent. 1991, Saddam and the Iran-Iraq War more or less ends in a stalemate. Khomeini dies a couple years later, somewhere around 89-90. He's replaced by another fellow named Khamenei, whose name is spelled almost the same way. It's only one letter off. It's really confusing. But anyway, 1991, Saddam gets greedy. And there's a country called Kuwait. It's a tiny Arab kingdom, very small, but they have a lot of oil, and the leadership was very rich, and they produce a lot of oil for the world. Saddam Hussein just straight up invades, just straight up goes in and tries to take it. And this leads to some trouble for Saddam, because the United States is looking at the situation and saying, well, first off, this was the most just like outright aggression of just someone just trying to come in and take over another country that we've seen since World War II. Even with some of these communist revolutions, a lot of times it's a little more subtle, like the Soviets would back a communist group inside the country and whatever, instead of just openly marching red troops in and taking over most of the time. But in this case, Iraq is just like straight up says, hey, Kuwait, I'm taking you and your stuff, and tries to take them over. So by now, the American president by 1991 is George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush to be president. And he puts together an international coalition that included most of the Arab governments, as well as most of the European governments and some Asian ones as well. And they put together this international task force that went in and launched a series of military operations. The first one was called Operation Desert Shield, and that turned into Operation Desert Storm. And sometimes this war is referred to as the Persian Gulf War. And the purpose of the Gulf War was to liberate the country of Kuwait from the controls of Iraq. Why did we care so much about them taking this little country? Well, there's a few reasons. First off, by now, most people had kind of accepted the rule that you just don't conquer countries anymore. It used to be the way everybody acted, and ever since World War II, people have kind of been like, nah, we don't do that anymore. Saddam just openly flouted it. So you want to establish the precedent that you just can't roll in and conquer countries. But more specifically, Kuwait was very important to the oil infrastructure of the world. If you took oil out of the world today, the modern economy stops. So we needed to protect that oil, but then also we wondered if just like with Hitler, how when Chamberlain and Daladier just let let Hitler march through Czechoslovakia, that encouraged him to go on to Poland and France and the Netherlands and Belgium. And we said if we just roll over and let Saddam Hussein take Kuwait, then he's going to want Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, and maybe he threatens Saudi Arabia, maybe he goes back to Iran, and we don't want the middle, and he certainly had desire to want to overthrow Israel, because even the more secularist Arab rulers, with the exception of the Egyptians who'd made peace with them, still wanted to destroy Israel for political benefits and anti-Jewish prejudice and so on. So we didn't want the Middle East to come into the clutches of this madman who was a mass murderer. And so we put together a troop, and we actually, it's very, very impressive. We basically drive the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait in less than 2 months. I think the whole war lasted maybe 6 weeks. We have an interesting decision to make at the end of the war. Do we try to remove Saddam Hussein, or do we leave him in place? Bush Sr. makes the decision to leave everything alone, rescue Kuwait, and then let Saddam remain in power in Iraq. People for years in the 90s, because Saddam keeps causing trouble. we have to go in. Then again, later on, when Clinton's president, we have to go like send bombing raids to Iraq on a couple times. We'll get to this next week, but come right around 2002, it looks increasingly like Saddam Hussein is going to go nuclear, and that leads to President George W. Bush, the second George Bush, to make the decision to go ahead and finish off what his father started and take Saddam out of power. But in the process of doing that, kind of makes it look like maybe Papa Bush might have been onto something by not getting us involved in, regime change in Iraq, because it really turned into a bit of a mess, although it certainly was, well-meaning. But anyway, so that we'll get to that when we get to the 2000s, and we'll talk about 9/11, some of that stuff. But one last thing from the 80s, 90s that we probably need to talk about to set up that kind of post 9/11 era as far as the Middle East. The other thing is in just outside what we consider the Middle East, in what we call the Central Asian region, lies the country of Afghanistan. It borders Iran. It also borders Pakistan. And so Afghanistan had a communist government as of a certain period of time in the 1970s. A rebel group tried to overthrow them. The Soviet Union responded by sending troops in to help prop up the communist regime. Of course, we talked about this in a previous video, that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan helps wear down the Soviet Union, puts them into debt with their military budget, and helps kind of bleed them out. But what's another thing that's really important, though, is that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan causes people from across the Arab world to go join this group of rebels known as the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen received, the help in terms of firearm sales and financial backing of the United States covert operations apparatus, because we were trying to, our number one enemy was the Soviet Union, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, was the thinking. The most charismatic and influential of these Mujahideen fighters is a fellow by the name of Osama bin Laden, who perhaps you have heard of him. Bin Laden was actually an unlikely figure to go be living in a cave trying to fight for Islamic theocracy. He was the son of one of the wealthiest families in Saudi Arabia. His parents were construction contractors that were so high class up on the totem pole that they were given the contract to remodel the city of Mecca, which is like the holy city that all the Muslims flock to once a year, that you're not even allowed into the city if you're not a Muslim, because they've got the Kaaba, remember, the famous shrine, remember from back in first semester when we talked about that. So bin Laden kind of emerges as this unlikely leader. When the war is over, and the Soviets give up and the Communist Party falls, the group that comes to power is a radical regime known as the Taliban, which installs Islamic government along the model of neighboring Iran, although the difference is Afghanistan is Sunni instead of Shiite. But it's a similar concept of being ruled by Islamic theocracy. And in fact, most people believe that the Taliban regime in Afghanistan was even a little more extreme than Khomeini's Iranian regime, which is saying quite a bit. Bin Laden, at the end of the Afghan war, takes his network of fighters that he's been working with them, and he organizes them into an organization known as Al-Qaeda, which is an Arabic word meaning the base. And they begin a number of terrorist activities throughout the 1990s, and that culminates with its peak in 2001 with the 9/11 attack, which we'll look at in more detail next week. But bin Laden was already a famous international bad guy. I was in high school when 9/11 happened. When I saw the towers on fire, the first thought that runs through my head is I wonder if it was that bin Laden guy, because he was already famous by the time I was in high school. So So that kind of, so remember that he's kind of a shark there lurking in the waters throughout the 1990s. And next week when we finish up with the 2000s, we'll kind of talk about how all that went down. So anyways, that kind of helps sets up the Middle East and how the U.S. got so tangled up in Middle Eastern affairs in the early 21st century. Y'all have yourselves a good day. I'll see y'all later.